Hello everyone, let's get started. This is session 2 for 2 to 2:45, building a framework for best-in-class contracting process.
Thanks for joining us this afternoon for our discussion, a panel discussion on building a framework for best-in-class contracting processes. And thanks to John and Jimmy for joining us on the panel, my esteemed panelists here. My role will be to pose the questions and shut up and let them answer the questions. So I do have some topics that we want to discuss, but I'm going to invite the audience to pose their own questions as we go along as well. So, let's start at the beginning. What I'd like to know from our panelists first is, before implementing contract management automation, what was the as-is state, and what were some of the typical challenges that you see as regards to contract management? Maybe John, start with you. Kind of the before picture.
Well, I've been at Cincinnati about 4 years, and we certainly haven't achieved automation yet. But when I started 4 years ago, we had no templates. We had nothing. Everything was 95% of everything was on supplier paper. We had a homegrown static contract database. You could type in some queries, and you get basically an Excel spreadsheet-looking thing with no hierarchy, no supplier names could be misspelled. If the contract number was wrong, the supplier name was misspelled, essentially it didn't exist because there was no way to find it. You could run a report that would tell you what contracts had expired, but it would never tell you in advance that something was about to expire. So that was basically the state of things 4 years ago.
Not a lot of visibility, not a lot of predictive kind of alerts and notifications.
The simplest, most repetitive thing required fresh work because we didn't lay anything in place.
Great. So Jimmy, kind of the same thing. I think you're maybe earlier in the stages of your automation or transformation. But looking at the current state or the before picture, how would you describe contract management, and what are some of the key challenges?
Well, I describe contract management. There's a number of definitions. I like to think that it's contract administration in terms of managing the number of contracts you have, and as well as monitoring contract compliance and performance. Those are things that we do within our organization. We just have multiple tools that don't exactly talk to each other or not integrate with each other. So we're in a sense effective at it, but not very efficient.
Okay. So one thing I like to think about is what was the tipping point for each of you? So I heard it said one time that change happens when the pain of where you're going to is less than the pain that you have today. So there has to be something that kind of said, at what point do you get looking at disparate systems and lack of visibility and so on, that just said, we got to bite the bullet and make a change? Was there a tipping point? Was there that seminal moment?
I don't think that there was one specific incident, at least in our organization. But over the last couple of years, the responsibility of the contract administration department at our organization that we discussed has grown. We're tasked with mitigating risk, being proactive in contract compliance. So it's the role that's expanded, and with that, we just really didn't have the back office technology to support those functions. There was one incident in last summer. Our organization is huge in supporting college internships, and we had the opportunity to work with a student from Texas A&M University. An Aggie, yes. And this morning when they were asking when you were in college, who thought we'd be working? Well, he's one of these guys.
Oh,
and he's a supply chain.
He said, "I want to grow up to be a German."
That's right. So he worked on a a process benchmarking project that looked at contract cycle time. And we discovered that, I guess the big discovery there was that on average, at least in our organization, we contract authoring and execution took about 20 to 25 days. And as part of the internship program, they presented this information to our executive administration team. And of course, our general counsel wanted to improve that cycle time however we could, so we were able to leverage that.
Okay. So there was kind of an aha moment.
There was one, yeah, it revolved around cycle time and exposing that.
Okay. John, in your case, any tipping point that said we got to make a change?
I think just before I arrived, there was some new management, and they were already in the process. There was a desire to, the VP and group to become more proactive. And they had received, we were getting too many calls that, could you check with this contract for me and find out when it expires? And we just the auto renewal deadline last week. And
That's a killer.
there were just three people, three sourcing the leads, and the contract manager did not provide 4,000 active contracts. So there was finally executive buy-in. So they were already in the process of implementing the contract management system when I started. But then two people left, and one person was left running it all by himself. I was brand new. So a year later, I had to go again.
So you
I
need
need so much we just twice.
That's right. Get it right the second time.
Exactly.
Okay. So you've each kind of touched on the fact that within the domain of contract management, there's really two key components or value levers. And Jimmy, you talked about the authoring process, shortening the cycle time from contract creation to approval. And then the other one is having a searchable repository, right? Or a repository that can track agreements, create alerts and notifications. And John, that's the one you did on. So I'm just curious, as each of you look at the two component parts, how would you weigh the relative value to your organization of authoring versus repository, and how you think about, from an implementation standpoint, which becomes the priority for your organization? So I'll throw that out to anybody that wants to jump on.
Well, in our case, we're further along in the contract, the repository.
So you started there.
It was what we already had, and we wanted to improve it, and so there was an effort to do that first. But on the automation, I've done a lot. The group has the luxury of having me, so there's no.
That's always a plus. That's a best.
I would like to recommend that as a best practice. It's not widely replicable.
Unless you clone yourself.
It's been discussed.
Okay.
But we don't have to rely on the general counsel's office. They're generally not involved in the sourcing process unless I throw my hand up.
Okay.
So I think when we keep the cycle time relatively short, but I like being able to not spend all the hours at work. So haven't gotten to the automation stage yet, but I put a lot of resources into creating templates and samples. I think the next step would be automating it, but we've at least done the first half that we've gone from maybe 0 to 50% of all the contracts being on our paper. In a lot of cases, with no substantial edge. And sitting on our master purchase agreement, which is probably 75% of our purchases now, instead of, typically you get through 1/3 of the total cost of done, which instead of, you get the supplier paper, and you have to market that after because it's just not good. On the repository side, certainly it's still overwhelming in a lot of cases to have 3, 4, 6 sourcing reviews trying to manage all the active contracts, but at least now there's some tool for accountability.
All right, more visibility.
We find, you can find things now, if you know it's supposed to be out there.
And having it searchable, right? So you can search on metadata information on the contract, do keyword search.
Yeah, and that was the other problem. You were stuck with a legacy set of metadata that would not be what you designed. So we eventually, when we did the second conversion, we sat down, what do we want to track? And we added a lot of things. We didn't throw anything away, but things got demoted, and we don't care about it.
Great, and likewise, Jimmy, I think you kind of said that approval cycle, that contract authoring process was your first priority, but how do you envision kind of the phasing of that? You know, how did you look at what you want to accomplish from a repository standpoint versus the authoring capability?
Well, from a repository standpoint, I think in our organization, we actually have a good tool. We use a naming convention for storing our contracts. It's just the transparency of data. It truly is simply a document repository. There is no metadata for tracking our contracts and running reports, expiration reports and such, which our department is responsible for. We rely on an in-house tool, and these devices don't speak to each other. So, our goal is to kind of automate that, as well as the authoring process. You know, technology behind the authoring process, in all honesty, is new to me. I mean, I hadn't really been exposed to it until we looked at these contract management solutions. So I do recognize some value there in terms of giving in our organization, the legal department, technology that they need to do their jobs. It looks like a pretty nifty tool. Of course, we haven't implemented it yet, but you know, the ability to automate all your contract templates, as well as contract clauses, building a library. Today in our environment, if we get pushback from a particular supplier in offering a contract, our attorneys have to have some fallback language, but in some cases they may have to go back and dig through old contracts and determine exactly what that language was. Whereas in these tools, you kind of got that at your fingertips. You got your fallback clauses.
Right. So standard clauses, but then a fallback is an alternative.
Right.
In the United States, you're going to get more standardization across those agreements, right? And I hear you saying authoring is the focus. You want to go back to the general counsel and show reducing that cycle time from 25 or 30 days and shrink that cycle. But then as the next phase, as you're into this, a searchable repository with metadata included, maybe the next step for you. Okay, excellent. So, one of the things that I've heard often in the past is, for any technology investment, we got to put together a business case. And for certain solutions in a full source-to-pay suite, that becomes more straightforward. Spend analytics, sourcing, pretty easy to create a very hard dollar return on investment, business case justification. Can be slightly more challenging in contract management. I'd be interested, A, if your organizations that was a requirement, and B, what do you look at as the key value levers in building a compelling business case specific to contract management?
I think you were right. In our case, we were able to, with the first two contract versions, we got away without doing the strict business case. It was just something that had to be done. When we got into doing the spin analytics, and I've since learned that we're not unique. I heard one indirect story about a company that had grown organically and had 53 separate accounting systems. But we have the legacy, we have a wireless accounting system for our wireless business, and we have a very strange one for our old legacy telco business. We have all sorts of, at least 6 major accounting systems that feed in. 2 instances of Great Plains and mainframe and all sorts of things. And we have multiple vendors for different entities. And so trying to tie in all that together, do some custom development work, we had to do a business case and ROI for that.
Okay, so it's really more from a systems integration standpoint.
And it involves a lot of different departments and
Okay.
resources.
You also mentioned a key event, which I've seen can sometimes be the burning platform, such as, we had a contract that auto-renewed that we never intended to, and now we're stuck with it for the next 3 years. Sometimes that alone, a compelling event like that, just avoiding that in the future can be a justification. Okay. And Jimmy would be interested in your case. How did you look at the business case for investing in contract management?
Yeah, and you make a good point. There's an inherent risk in any contract, any financial transaction. And oftentimes you don't, I guess they're hard to quantify, and you can't quantify them until you experience a loss. So you want to be able to mitigate that risk. But we had an occurrence where I think it involved an Oracle database contract where we weren't exactly complying with the license agreement and had to incur some penalties to the tune of about $3 million. So it's one of those occurrences that when you try to justify a contract management tool, you get a lot of support.
Yeah, I think avoiding getting whacked for $3 million in penalties would justify in most cases.
What we did was actually created a vendor management organization where we identified specific roles and responsibilities. Fortunately for us, we had a lot of support from our CIO, who was instrumental in actually making that happen. Our department is primarily responsible for just administering the program, but making sure that that we're proactive in assessing contract performance, and that we call it forcing communication, and meeting with our suppliers, meeting with our business users on a quarterly basis, depending on I guess the criticality of the contract. But we've been doing this for a couple of years and just learned as that role expanded that we really needed some technology to help support it. We had to scrub data from our ERP system to provide financials for each one of our contracts and such. So something we were doing, but
So spending less time gathering data, more time analyzing would be higher value add and justify the investment, no question. So John, as we shared, you're maybe a little bit further along in the automation. Okay, a little bit, we need a little credit here. It'd be great to know at this stage at Cincinnati Bell, how has your overall performance improved in terms of cycle time reduction, or more throughput, or any other productivity gains that you can quantify around contract management?
A few different areas. One thing we did manage to automate, I think it's helped us more from a client standpoint. Before we had the static database, and the only check to whether or not when a requisition or blanket purchase order would come through, someone would see it, have to approve it, and there was supposed to be a contract number filled in. And they would look at the contract number and they would take it, they would try to match it up to a contract. But we might have 30 documents, a master agreement, SOWs, and amendments that all have the same contract number. So it was really hard it was impossible to really track the spend.
So you have a hierarchy of agreements.
Hierarchy of agreements, and this would be CBT 2130, and that would be that entire business relationship. And it could literally be 3 feet of binders each other. And it was impossible to track any of the.
And you need to see those all together to have the chronology of.
And if we're doing it with a company like Cisco, there might be 3 different Cisco entities. And some of them would be misspelled. Cisco Capital,
like the food service, the SYS.
I swear one of the problems we ran into when we did the first database conversion is no one scrubbed the database. So literally, we had a bunch of capital leases with Cisco Capital, 15 of them, and there were 6 different spellings. with ink, without ink, with period, without a period. One of them spelled capital with an E. And so we ended up with 6 different vendors in the first database.
So normalizing has to be the first step, right?
Yeah, normalized. And so we did that the second time. But now we've automated the vendor process. The other problem we had, adding a new vendor, used to be printing off a form on the website, filling in all the data, and faxing it or emailing it to the AV folks who would create the vendor. Now, what part of that involved in sourcing?
Right, to vet that new vendor.
To vet the new.
Yeah, sure.
So, and it had required paper, and then had to be re-entered by the AV folks. So not only did the first person have to write it and type it, the second person had to re-enter it. Now it's all automated through the sourcing group. So we just go in and we add it, and we've already gotten the information. So someone just adds it and it flows straight through. So that's helped a lot, both in compliance and efficiency.
Excellent. And Jimmy, of course, you're earlier in the process, but what would you say are some of the near-term and longer-range goals as you look at the contract management process? And for instance, you mentioned 25 to 30 days is the cycle time. The current state process, have you set a target for what we want that cycle time to be with the benefit of automation?
We've targeted a 25% reduction in cycle time. That's our goal. Hopefully we can achieve that. I mean, near term, we just want to roll this application out. We're kind of in that process now, and in transition from our current environment, which is about 5 different applications and tools and spreadsheets, into this one tool, so that we should see some benefit there. And long term, we'd like to use the technology's functionality to improve our ability to manage contracts or our reach across the organization. Part of my staff today includes 2 vendor managers, and we primarily focus on the key suppliers, which are about 25 suppliers. And we're a bit resource constrained. We may have about 500 contracts in place, but the majority of our spend goes to these key suppliers. But utilizing the technology to flag contract milestones, contract deliverables, and be able to run reports on that, just have some transparency into that. That's longer term. I'd like to be able to utilize that technology. If I can expand our scope from 25 key suppliers to 50, that would be a win.
Sure, absolutely. I know you've done some similar things at Cincinnati Bell in terms of stratifying the supplier base, right? Some that you are the key strategic
So we have
suppliers.
strategic vendors, critical vendors, and then everyone else.
Right, so really a best practice in stratifying the supply base. And who do I need to pay those concessions? So I want to talk for a second about adoption. We talked about that, we talked about a lot this morning, and that's true across the suite of solutions. Source to pay adoption is always a big challenge. And contract management is no exception. You're having to involve many other stakeholders in the business, not to mention legal. So I'll bash legal a little bit. Some organizations, they've sort of just graduated from the red pen to the red line. And how do you get them on board? And then maybe the Microsoft Word red line if they're comfortable with it. How do you get them, the legal group, and other stakeholders on board with a contract management tool that you want to roll with?
I still struggle with the automation part. I think part of the reason, that's my next, I'm working on that the next couple quarters, that I like Microsoft Word. I'm very comfortable with that. And I'm comfortable using a restricted tool. Plus I have to rewrite all my templates be clause-oriented instead of document and alternative-oriented.
So that's one reason why a tool like this, you really need to be able to export and import from an application like Microsoft Word.
But just from a user adoption standpoint, it's got to be simple because when we did the first, it was one of the two major problems we had with the first contract management system we implemented. One was the data integrity problem, which I hinted at. The other was no one would use it. At that time, we had several, a guy had been in the industry for 30 years. It was an old telecom sales guy who was doing sourcing now, and he was very good at it. The last thing he wanted to do was fiddle around with a program that had lots of menus and hid drop-down menus in line underlines. It looks like a link, but it's really a drop-down menu that you can't see until you mouse over it, and then a little triangle appears down. So when you're just looking at it, it looks like a link.
Not intuitive.
You shouldn't have 3 levels of user interface on the screen. It's really, it needs to look like Gmail, and everything's there, and then people can use it. So we've had much better success with Zycus because there are no embedded menus. That's good.
It's all above board, it's all transparent, no embedded menus. Jimmy, what are you looking at in terms of adoption? How many different functions are you looking to bring into the tool? And what do you think your goals are in terms of overall adoption?
In terms of function, I mean, we're looking at the supplier qualification and onboarding process, and using the Zycus supplier tool for that. Adoption should be, in this case, relatively easy because that function primarily is handled by procurement. So we're doing it on a spreadsheet today. So adoption is it's a slam dunk.
Yeah, when the new system, you're going to say, isn't this going to make your life easier than the spreadsheet based?
Well, I'll backtrack a little bit. We're going to use what the Zycus tool allows us is, since it's a SaaS solution, we're actually going to rely on the supplier to key in their data through a web portal.
Yep.
So I don't have to key it in anymore, and I don't have to key it into 6 different systems. So that's huge. Contract management, we're authoring, reporting, and archival. And I think the third focus area for us is contract compliance and contract performance management. So we're going to use iPerform to scorecard our vendors. I talked about our VMO program, so that would be a huge element. We have a lot of support internally today for the vendor management program because we've seen benefit there, financial benefit. We've mitigated risk, just making sure that our key suppliers are aligned with us in terms of the roadmap. There's a lot of transparency there. There's good benefit. So for us, it's just a matter of putting the right technology behind it.
So I was going to ask you each about your evaluation process. You've selected Zycus for contract management. Thank you very much for that. But one of the things I hear you saying too, Jimmy, is you did look at maybe contract management as an island. How does it relate to other components of a source to pay suite, whether it's supplier onboarding or supplier performance management? But I'd be interested if each of you could just talk briefly to what kind of evaluation process did you go to before selecting Zycus, and what were some of the key selection criteria?
In my case, I got to pick the second vendor, and I totally.
So you said, let's not repeat the mistakes of the.
Yeah, and by the way, who will help us clean up our mess? Because we had, at that point, we had frozen down, our first database didn't go away, but we had imported all the data from database 1 to database 2. So we had a 2010 snapshot of all the data, and then we had about a year's worth of data in the second database. And a lot of it was really messy because it hadn't been cleaned up. There had been some manual work, but.
So you had to do a migration.
And a merge.
Because
for some reason, when the first conversion was done, a lot of fields that could have been added, that would have been optional, were just dropped. And things like description.
That's not really an optional.
So, description and notes, which are often two of the most enlightening fields, were just dropped. And so we wanted to recapture that data for all the older contracts. So I would sit down with the vendor and look at their pretty slides of their suite, and that was great, and that was nice. But here's our problem. And Zycus was the only one who said, you should talk to this person. I think maybe we have someone who can help.
So being willing to come in and clean up the mess.
Being willing to help. Help clean up. Because one of the problems we had before was just, if we had a problem, maybe in 2 years it'll be on our roadmap. But now we really can't do that. We can't help you. We can't wipe the database, start over, merge everything. No, we can't do that.
So responsiveness is key. What would you say about having contract management as part of a broader suite, how it relates to sourcing?
Well, initially we were just looking at the contract and the sourcing tool.
Yeah.
And the sourcing tool was easy. You basically flip the switch and it's on because you don't have to import all your legacy RFPs and stuff. The contract stuff took some work, but initially we were just looking at those two pieces. And then the spend and everything had to do with business case for later. Maybe we can address this problem and the fact that the supplier portal is great, with the suppliers entering their own data, and then we just when we're ready to, for that to be in the AP system, we just click a button in there in our AP system.
Right, and having then a supplier management tool, onboarding tool that's integrated with contract.
And that came later.
Yeah.
Initially, we were just looking at the contract and sourcing, because that was what we already had. You really have to make a business case when you're adding and using.
Right, so the first is replacing what's not really working.
Right, and we already had a cost, so you're just replacing cost for cost.
Okay.
Adding a new cost, you have to make a business case.
Understood. Makes sense. Jimmy, could you comment on your evaluation process and criteria?
Sure. We put quite a bit of effort into defining our functional requirements and our business rules and such into an RFP document, workflows, and had quite a competitive field for responses. And for us, it was mainly about experience and qualifications of the suppliers. We were looking for someone whose core competency was procurement and contract management, where it wasn't a secondary line of business. We found that in Zycus. What was helpful to us as well in differentiating the suppliers is we required a demo that was kind of a proof of concept where they incorporated our requirements and
Like a scripted then?
yes,
For your columns, Chuck.
right. And we noticed that Zycus was most responsive to that, incorporating our requirements. So, and at the end of the day, cost was a big factor as well. And cost was really good.
Okay.
We did the same thing with we raised Zycus. They set up the same, we're like, that sounds great that you converge these two databases. Before we do any customization, we all put a lot of work in, let's do a sandbox. So they built the sandbox and did the match, and like 80% of the contracts for these two databases matched. And it worked. It passed the Kathy test, right?
The infamous Kathy test.
The infamous Kathy test.
Yes. So you got a sense of, here's, the migration is going to work.
It's going to work, and you're not just blowing smoke.
We asked for a product roadmap as well. We feel that that's always gives you good insight into what the tool doesn't do.
Right. All right, what's coming in the next releases, and how soon is it coming? Because that's the other thing, is if the roadmap is 2 and 3 years out, how much good is it going to do today instead of 2 or 3 months out?